Ingmar Bergman's 1982 classic, it's Fanny and Alexander. What's this movie about? What makes it great? Why might you want to watch it? Let's talk about that coming up next. Fanny and Alexander is a 5.5 hour Swedish movie or TV show that Bergman released in 1982, almost 40 years into his storied film career. This is almost certainly one of his best movies, maybe even his best movie. The question though, is it a movie or is it a TV miniseries? You can experience it either way. If you watch the TV version, it's 5 episodes long, 5.5 hours, or you can watch the condensed movie version, 3 hours long. I strongly recommend watching the TV miniseries, which really is a 5.5 hour movie, because it's the most, I think, impactful. The 3 hour movie cuts out too much, and so the long version is the one to go with here. The movie brings up a lot of classic Bergman contrasts that he explored throughout his life, but here this is perhaps his most intense movie about these themes, including the division between the world of imagination, represented by a theater company owned by Fanny and Alexander's father, and their mother is an actress in this troupe, and they hang around the actors and actresses, and they have an extended family that seems to be just as interesting, vivacious, and or in an ornate setting, just like the theater troupe. In contrast to that is the stark, cold rooms and interiority of the bishop, a character who comes in about halfway through the movie. Not much of a spoiler alert here. Alexander's father, Alexander's the boy who featured throughout the movie, his father dies about an hour and a half into the movie, and then his mother remarries a bishop figure, a bishop in the Swedish church, and once she does that and the two children go into the household of the bishop, then the movie really takes a dark and twisted turn. And the division is between, on the one hand, stale and formal Christianity, and then this world of imagination, sometimes associated with Jewishness, or at least the world of the theater. That comes up later. Both of those come up later in the movie, as well as the ornate settings, a rich, colorful schema of the world of the theater company versus the world of the bishop, stark, cold, dare we say, Scandinavian-style interiors. And Fanny and Alexander then shows us two ways that Bergman really has designed his movies. You've either got, on the one hand, Winter Light, the old 1960s movie about a tormented pastor who isn't sure if he believes in God or not. And these moments with the bishop really resemble the shots in Winter Light. In fact, the whole Faith trilogy from Bergman, Through a Glass Darkly, included. And then the world of the theater company, well, Bergman had just made The Magic Flute, the Mozart opera, into a film in the mid-1970s. It looks kind of like that, and he's got other sort of more ornate movies, but not as much as the Winter Light style. And here you get these two things contrasted, mirroring the world of imagination and fantasy that Alexander seems to want to enter into. He's into reading books, he's into imagining things in his head, and then the bishop, who can't imagine anything, is into reality and principles, but of course he's a terrible hypocrite. So you have this contrast between these two very different worlds, and I think in part you should read this as a psychobiography from Bergman. He's exploring his own past, his own childhood, his own being raised in the Christian faith, with his father as this sort of stark, cold pastor figure, but then in the theater and in the world of film for the last 40 plus years, these two things are part of Bergman. And whenever he talks about boys, as in his classic movies like The Silence and Persona, you remember Persona, there's a boy at the beginning and end of that movie who could be a Bergmanian character or about Bergman himself. I think Alexander is really in part Bergman, and I would strongly recommend reading up a little bit on Bergman's biography, because I think you'll see it a lot in this movie. The Bishop is a memorable movie villain. In fact, I think one of the better movie villains I can recall. Realistic, yet sort of fantastical in a way. He's cold, he's stark, he's hypocritical, and there's a quality about him I really admire, and I may or may not be right about this, but he reminds me of the talk in Plato's dialogues about tyrants who suffer more than the characters of the people who they cause suffering to. In other words, tyrants who dish out cruelty are more miserable, according to Plato, than people who actually experience misery and suffer because of that. That's this very strange concept to get your head around. Who knows if it's right or not, but I feel like this bishop is that kind of tyrant figure who suffers because he's a tyrant and he's miserable on the inside. Certainly wants the approval of Alexander and his family. He is a little bit vain, I suppose, and he's into, making sure that Alexander obeys in his particular ways, and Alexander is a rebel figure who will not do that. And so the bishop struggles with that.
Jag älskar dig. Men kärleken, det vill säga den kärlek jag hyser för dig och din mor och din syster, är inte blind och inte mjäkig. Den är stark och kärv, Alexander.
You have to think about movie villains. Typically, they're cruel and they're having fun being sadistic. In this movie, it doesn't feel like the bishop is having fun. He's vain, he's in debt, he wants approval from people, he wants them to, admire him, and he seems to suffer just as much as Alexander throughout this movie. Movie contrasts Christianity and Judaism, something Bergman had done a couple of times in his career. Certainly in this movie, it's the Christianity of the bishop, stark, stale, cold, and really there's no church in the movie, there's no doctrine, the bishop just represents the stale old church. And then the Jewish members of the cast here help Alexander out, and then you get this contrast between the sort of old, perhaps Jewish mysticism, maybe even the Old Testament versus New Testament here, and sort of an inversion of what those typically represent. Here, this bishop is very cruel, as we said. The Jewish character in this, Isaac Jacobi, is a very kind old man, and then we go into the Jewish shop later in the movie, and it's a very interesting contrast with all of the other settings. Bergman is definitely at his best here, I think, in terms of camera movements, set design, blocking characters, and everything he's ever learned is in this movie. At 5.5 hours, you will see nearly every kind of thing that Bergman can do, and he is, by this time, a wizard, or a magician as he might prefer, with the camera. The movie definitely also contrasts extended family with step family in the classic fairy tales or folk tales. You don't want a stepmother. Here it's a stepfather in the character of the bishop, and definitely those step parents are harmful and awful, and their family members as well, including the bishop's own mother and other people in his household. And I think very importantly, the play Hamlet comes up here very early and then continues throughout. Again, and not a spoiler alert, when Alexander's father dies, he comes back as a ghost. This is foretold in the opening where you see Hamlet's father in the play Hamlet by Shakespeare coming back and haunting Hamlet, but you get Alexander's father haunting the scenery here, sometimes not talking, but sometimes talking, and this is definitely, I think, Bergman's most mystical, perhaps even his most religious film, because you've got ghosts, you've got demons, perhaps, at least episode 5 is titled Demons, and you have magical and mystical things that, well, are they happening or not? Maybe it's part of the stagecraft of the movie here, or maybe it's real. Bergman is not sure, but you do have a lot of ghosts in this movie, and those, I think, were cut from the 3-hour movie, but they're in the 5.5-hour TV series. That's why, again, you should watch this. Bergman's usually a very realistic director, probing psychological problems, disorders of the mind or the brain, but here he is going at least partly mystical, and that's very interesting, certainly to play up the fact that film and art and imagination are priorities as opposed to the realistic world, so-called, of the bishop. This is a great children's movie, not for children, but about children. I think it's one about growing up, childhood development, and the things that torment us for the rest of our lives because of what we suffered in childhood. I think this is also a tale of abuse, emotional abuse in particular. Bergman's always attended to healthcare and sort of unseen or unknown problems with families, sort of social work kinds of problems. Here, this is the case certainly for Alexander and Fanny, his sister. All in all, I think this is a masterwork that deserves the attention of viewers. I think this movie gets better as it goes. So once you get into episode 4 and 5, I think a lot of people will enjoy that. I think you got to get through the first episode where not much plot happens, but it's a setup as well as a contrast. The Christmas feast that takes place through 90 minutes in that first episode really is supposed to contrast with the bishop, who is the Christian figure, but the Christmas celebration and feasts are way better. The extended family is better than the step-parent. That opening episode, you got to think about what's going on there, but really once you get to episode 5, I think everybody, pretty close to everybody watching this video, will at least appreciate some of what's going on in this movie. For all that, I never recommend movies over 3 hours usually, but this one, well, this is good, and it's a preparation for what's to come even today with these longer miniseries or longer extended TV series. Bergman's able to explore more character depth here and tell more of a story and give us sumptuous feasts for the eyes. So please watch this movie. I think it's quite good. What do you think of Fanny and Alexander? Let us know in the comments. And please subscribe to this channel for more content. Thank you and have a great day.